At approximately 9:40 in the morning on July 25, 1944, the sky over Normandy turned black with aircraft. More than 3,000 American bombers and fighter bombers darkened the sun above the hedgerow country south of St. Lo. The roar of their engines merged into a single continuous thunder that could be heard 30 miles away. French farmers in villages far from the target zone looked up and crossed themselves. Children ran to windows. Old men who remembered the trenches of the First War shook their heads. Nothing in their experience compared to this. Below that steel cloud, dug into the ancient earthen embankments of the Norman bocage, the men of the Panzer Lehr Division waited in their foxholes. They were among the finest soldiers in the German army, veterans of years of combat on the Eastern Front and in Italy, equipped with Panther tanks and trained to a razor edge of tactical excellence. Their commander, General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, had served as Rommel's chief of staff in the Afrika Korps and knew what Allied firepower could do. He had seen British artillery at El Alamein. He had watched American bombers turn Tunisian positions into moonscapes, but nothing in his long experience of war had prepared him for what was about to happen. At 9:40 that morning, the first bombs began to fall. Within 60 minutes, the Panzer Lehr Division would effectively cease to exist as a fighting force. The most powerful concentration of tactical firepower ever assembled in the history of warfare was about to demonstrate why German units, despite their legendary skill and iron discipline, could not survive against American combined arms tactics. This is not simply a story of overwhelming numbers. It is a story of systems and doctrine, of how an army that had been humiliated 18 months earlier transformed itself into a killing machine that would destroy the German military in the West. The American army that landed on the beaches of North Africa in November of 1942 bore little resemblance to the force that would break out of Normandy 2 years later. These were green troops facing battle-hardened German and Italian veterans for the first time. Their equipment was untested in real combat. Their commanders had never led large formations under fire. And their understanding of combined arms warfare, the coordination of infantry, armor, artillery, and air power into a single integrated system, was largely theoretical. Between February 19th and February 24th of 1943, at Kasserine Pass in the Atlas Mountains of Tunisia, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps inflicted one of the most humiliating defeats in American military history. The Second Corps under Major General Lloyd Fredendall was driven back more than 80 kilometers across the rocky desert terrain. American units suffered roughly 6,500 casualties against approximately 2,000 Axis losses. The 1st Armored Division was torn apart by piecemeal commitment. Its tanks fed into battle in small packets that German panzers destroyed one by one, while American infantry watched helplessly from the ridgelines. The problems at Kasserine went far deeper than battlefield losses. Fredendall had positioned his headquarters some 70 miles behind the front, in an elaborate underground complex carved into rock by engineers. A decision that isolated him from his troops and signaled a commander more concerned with personal safety than tactical awareness. Communications between units broke down. Infantry and armor failed to support each other. Artillery responded too slowly. Air support arrived late or not at all. The Germans, by contrast, demonstrated the fluid combined arms coordination they had perfected in Poland, France, and Russia. Panzers and infantry worked together seamlessly. Stukas provided close support. The contrast was devastating. Rommel's private assessment of the Americans was brutal. He noted that they abandoned positions at the first sign of pressure and seemed to have no stomach for close combat. But Rommel was too experienced a soldier to dismiss an enemy entirely. These Americans, he observed, learned quickly. Their logistics were already formidable, and their industrial base was beyond anything Germany could match. Give them time, Rommel warned, and they would become dangerous opponents. The lessons of Kasserine Pass were absorbed with a speed that surprised even Rommel. Within about 2 weeks of the disaster, Fredendall was relieved of command and replaced by George S. Patton, who arrived at Second Corps headquarters like a thunderstorm. Officers who had failed were removed within hours. Discipline was tightened brutally. Training intensified. Patton demanded that his officers lead from the front, not from bunkers carved into distant hillsides. On March 23, 1943, barely a month after Kasserine, the 1st Infantry Division demonstrated what a reformed American force could do. At El Geta, The Big Red One funneled attacking German panzers into prepared kill zones and shattered them with massed, centrally controlled artillery fire. American gunners fired hundreds of rounds per battery as German tanks burned in the passes. Mines channeled armor into fields of interlocking fire. Infantry held their positions under counterattack. It was a preview of what would happen at Mortain 17 months later. But the changes that mattered most were not in personnel. They were in doctrine. In July of 1943, the War Department published Field Manual 100-20, titled Command and Employment of Air Power. This document declared in capital letters that land power and air power are co-equal and interdependent forces, and that neither is an auxiliary of the other. That sentence revolutionized American military operations. It broke the chain that had previously tied tactical aircraft to ground commanders, forcing them to support whatever unit happened to be in front of them. Now, airmen could concentrate their strength where it would have maximum effect. 3 organizational decisions made in the years before the war created the architecture for American combined arms superiority. The first was the adoption of the Triangular Infantry Division between 1939 and 1942. The old square divisions of the First World War had been cumbersome and defensive in orientation. The new Triangular Division gave each formation 3 infantry regiments instead of 4, each with 3 battalions, supported by 4 field artillery battalions and a full complement of anti-tank, engineer, and reconnaissance troops. It was a leaner, more mobile formation, designed from the ground up for offensive combined arms operations. The second decision was Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair's insistence on standardized training through the great maneuvers in Louisiana, Tennessee, and Carolina. In 1940 and 1941, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers practiced coordinated operations across thousands of square miles of countryside. Infantry learned to work with tanks. Tanks learned to work with artillery. Artillery learned to respond to forward observers. Communications networks were tested and refined. Mistakes made in Louisiana were corrected before soldiers reached combat. The third and perhaps most important decision had been made even earlier. At Fort Sill in Oklahoma, the Field Artillery School had developed something no other army in the world possessed. Under officers like Major Carlos Brewer and Major Orlando Ward in the late 1920s and early 1930s, the school created a fire direction center system that could mass the fires of multiple artillery battalions on a single target within minutes. This system revolutionized artillery employment. The traditional method used by every European army required artillery officers to identify targets by terrain features. They would describe a location relative to landmarks, calculate ranges individually, and fire their batteries independently. It was slow, cumbersome, and limited to what a single battery commander could see. The American system abandoned this approach entirely. Instead, every battery position was surveyed to a common coordinate grid using precision instruments. Every target was plotted against that same grid. A forward observer could radio a set of coordinates, and any battery in range could fire on that target in any direction within minutes. The technique's most feared application was called time on target. Multiple batteries, often from different battalions or even different corps, would calculate their shell flight times and fire on a countdown coordinated by the Fire Direction Center. The shells from every gun, traveling different distances at different velocities, would all arrive at the target simultaneously. German soldiers who survived these concentrations described them with something approaching horror. There was no warning. The first shell to land was joined by dozens of others in the same instant. There was no time to take cover. Everything arrived at once. By the time American forces landed in Sicily in July of 1943 and began the long, bloody slog up the Italian peninsula, these doctrines were maturing in actual combat. Air-ground coordination procedures were refined battle by battle. Armored column cover techniques were tested in the mountains south of Rome. Infantry learned to work with tanks using field telephones welded to the rear plates of Shermans, allowing riflemen to speak with tank crews who were buttoned up inside their vehicles, unable to hear anything over the engine noise. Artillery forward observers perfected their craft through thousands of fire missions. The Italian campaign was a brutal teacher. At Salerno in September of 1943, German counterattacks nearly drove the Fifth Army back into the sea. At Anzio in January of 1944, a beachhead that was supposed to outflank the German line became a bloody stalemate. American divisions learned hard lessons about coordinating infantry, armor, and artillery in mountainous terrain against an enemy who knew how to use every ridge and village for defense. The mistakes made in Italy would not be repeated in France. When Omar Bradley's First Army came ashore at Omaha and Utah beaches on June 6, 1944, it carried not just men and machines, but a 2-year deep toolkit of battle-tested methods. The soldiers who waded through the surf were supported by an integrated system that connected the rifle squad to the army group. Behind them came the vast logistical apparatus that would sustain months of continuous combat. Normandy nearly swallowed that doctrine whole. Behind the invasion beaches stretched the bocage, a landscape unlike anything the Americans had trained for in Louisiana or fought through in Italy. Ancient earthen embankments, 4 to 15 feet high, divided the Norman countryside into thousands of small fields, each surrounded by tangled hedgerows of brambles and twisted trees. These embankments, built up over centuries by farmers clearing stones from their fields, created a natural fortress system. The fields between them were often no larger than 300 feet across, limiting visibility and channeling movement into predictable corridors. German defenders exploited this terrain with the skill of veterans. They dug foxholes directly into the embankments, positioning machine guns to cover the natural corridors between fields and sighting them for grazing fire just inches above the ground. Every gap in the hedgerows was registered by mortars zeroed to the meter. Every approach was covered by 88mm anti-tank guns that could destroy a Sherman at 1,000 yards. American tanks that tried to climb over the embankments exposed their thin belly armor at the moment of greatest vulnerability and were destroyed by waiting Panzerfaust teams. Progress through the bocage was measured in yards and bodies. The drive to the crossroads town of Saint-Lô, which Allied planners had expected to capture around 9 days after the landing, cost the First Army approximately 40,000 casualties for a gain of barely 7 miles in the central sector. The 29th Infantry Division suffered approximately 3,700 casualties during the Saint-Lô offensive alone. Day after day, American infantry companies attacked across the same hedgerows their predecessors had died trying to take. Small unit leaders were killed at rates that stripped battalions of their experienced sergeants and lieutenants. The daily routine of hedgerow fighting developed its own brutal rhythm. A company would advance at dawn, moving toward the next field boundary. Machine gun fire would open from the far hedgerow, pinning men in the open. Mortars would begin falling within seconds, pre-registered on the approaches. Tanks would be called forward, but the narrow lanes forced them to advance in column, where a single anti-tank gun could destroy vehicle after vehicle. Engineers would attempt to blow gaps with Bangalore torpedoes or satchel charges, taking casualties as they worked. If the company made it across one field, the process would begin again at the next hedgerow. By nightfall, an advance of 200 yards might have cost a platoon half its strength. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers learned to dread the sound of German mortars, which gave almost no warning before impact. The MG-42 machine gun, firing 1,200 rounds per minute, created a continuous ripping sound that veterans remembered decades later. Men who had survived D-Day found themselves killed in anonymous hedgerow fights that would never appear in history books. Replacement soldiers arrived, were fed into the line, and became casualties before learning the names of the men beside them. On July 17, 1944, Major Thomas D. Howie, commanding the 3rd Battalion of the 116th Infantry Regiment, was killed by mortar shrapnel, moments after radioing his division commander with the words, "See you in Saint-Lô." When the 29th Division finally entered the wrecked town the following day, Major Howie's flag-draped body was carried on the hood of the lead jeep through the shattered streets and laid in the rubble of the Sainte-Croix Church. A 1944 French photographic booklet had already dubbed Saint-Lô the capital of the ruins, a phrase that Samuel Beckett would later adopt for a 1946 essay. The city had been destroyed to approximately 95%. Yet even as American divisions bled in the hedgerows, they were adapting. Units experimented with every possible solution to the bocage problem. Some tried explosives to blow gaps through the embankments, but the charges had to be placed under fire. Some tanks were fitted with bulldozer blades. The most famous solution came from Sergeant Curtis Grubb Culin, the 3rd of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, an independent mechanized cavalry unit attached to the 5th Corps of First Army. Kulin welded scrap steel from captured German beach obstacles into 4 prongs that fitted to the front of a Sherman tank. When General Bradley watched a demonstration on July 14th, the modified tank ripped through a hedgerow in seconds without exposing its belly armor. Bradley ordered the device, which soldiers called the Rhino, into mass production. By the start of Operation Cobra, roughly 3 of every 5 tanks in First Army carried the cutter. Approximately 500 units were manufactured in Normandy within 2 weeks. On the morning of July 25, 1944, 1,121 officers and enlisted men of the Panzer Lehr Division occupied defensive positions along the Saint-Lô to Perrier's Road. The weather in Normandy was finally clearing after days of low cloud and drizzling rain that had grounded Allied aircraft. In their foxholes and command bunkers, German soldiers performed routine maintenance on their weapons, checked ammunition supplies, and waited. General Fritz Bayerlein had entered July 25th with only about 2,200 combat-effective frontline troops remaining, barely a fraction of his authorized strength. His tank strength had dwindled to approximately 12 serviceable Panzer IVs, 16 Panthers, and perhaps 30 additional tanks in various states of repair. This was already a shadow of a full-strength Panzer division, which should have fielded more than 100 tanks and 15,000 men. At approximately 9:40 that morning, the first wave of roughly 600 Allied fighter bombers swept in over the American lines. They struck a strip immediately in front of the waiting infantry. For the next hour, roughly 1,500 heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force saturated a target box measuring 6,000 by 2,500 yards with high explosive and incendiary bombs. Wave after wave dropped their loads and turned for home as the next formation arrived. Medium bombers followed the heavies. Fighter bombers circled and dove to strafe anything that moved. In total, approximately 3,000 aircraft dropped some 4,000 tons of bombs on a strip of Norman farmland barely 2 miles deep. The tragedy of Operation Cobra was that some of this destruction fell on American soldiers. Perpendicular bomb runs placed heavy bombers directly over friendly positions when they released their loads. Bomb sights of that era were imprecise. Wind drift was unpredictable. Some crews released early to avoid flak. On July 25th, approximately 111 American soldiers were killed and 490 wounded by short bombing. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the architect of Army Ground Forces doctrine, and the man most responsible for the training system that had transformed the American Army. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed in action in the European theatre. For the Panzer Lehr Division, the bombing was apocalyptic. Bayerlein's account, given to American interrogators after the war and preserved in the Foreign Military Studies series, remains one of the most frequently quoted passages in all the literature of the Western Front. "The bombers kept coming," Bayerlein said, as if on a conveyor belt. Back and forth the carpets were laid until the weights of the bombs reached the borders of the area. Artillery positions were wiped out. Tanks were overturned and buried in craters. Infantry positions were flattened, and all roads and tracks were destroyed. By midday, the entire area resembled a moonscape with bomb craters touching rim to rim. All signal communications had been cut, and no command was possible. The shock effect on the troops was indescribable. Several of my men went mad and rushed around in the open until they were cut down by splinters. Bayerlein continued his account with the precision of a staff officer who had learned to observe even while his world collapsed. Simultaneously with the storm from the air, he said, innumerable guns of American artillery pounded drumfire into our field positions. Over 70% of my soldiers were either dead, wounded, crazed, or dazed after the barrage. Bayerlein estimated his losses at roughly 1,000 men killed, wounded, or incapacitated in those 60 minutes. 3 battalion command posts were destroyed entirely. Most of his remaining armor was obliterated or buried under tons of earth. When Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge's staff relayed orders to hold the line on July 26th, Bayerlein's reply carried the bitterness of a commander watching his unit die. "Out in front everyone is holding out," he said. "Everyone. My grenadiers and my engineers and my tank crews are all holding their ground. Not a single man is leaving his post. They are lying silent in their foxholes because they are dead. The Panzer Lehr Division is annihilated. Only the dead can now hold the line." The ground assault on July 25th made slower initial progress than Bradley and Collins had hoped. American divisions advanced only about 2,000 yards against surviving strongpoints of 88mm guns and the largely intact German 5th Parachute Division to the west. But Major General J. Lawton Collins, commanding the 7th Corps, was reading the intelligence summaries and sensing the stunned silence on the German side. Something fundamental had broken in the German defense. On July 26th, Collins made the decision that transformed the entire campaign. Against doctrine, against caution, he ordered the armoured divisions forward through gaps that had not yet been fully secured. It was the decisive call of the campaign. The gamble paid off beyond anyone's expectations. By July 27th, organised German resistance had collapsed. By July 30th, the critical road junction at Avranches was in American hands. 2 days later, on August 1st, Patton's newly activated Third Army began pouring through the gap the Germans could no longer close. The reason Panzer Lehr disintegrated in an hour was not the bombing alone. It was the arrival of American combined arms warfare at full industrial scale. 3 interlocking systems converged over the Norman countryside that summer, and the Germans had no answer for any of them. The first was the American Fire Direction Center system. Unlike German artillery, which required careful pre-surveying of positions and terrain-based target identification, the American system allowed any battery in range to fire on any target within minutes. Forward observers in Piper Cub aircraft circled over the battlefield like patient vultures, watching for any sign of German movement. When they spotted a target, they radioed coordinates to the Fire Direction Center. A target spotted at 10 in the morning could have shells landing on it by 10:15. Time-on-target missions demonstrated this capability at its most devastating. When Collins needed to suppress a strongpoint, he could call on artillery battalions from adjacent divisions and from corps. The Fire Direction Centers coordinated the shoot, calculated flight times for shells traveling different distances at different velocities, and fired on a countdown. German defenders learned to dread the silence before a concentration. There was no ranging shot to warn them. The weapons themselves were decisive. The M2A1 105mm howitzer served as the standard divisional piece. The M1 155mm howitzer, which soldiers called the Long Tom, delivered heavier shells to ranges of about 14 miles. New time-fused airburst shells doubled the lethal footprint against troops in the open. Rommel himself, reviewing the situation before his wounding on July 17th, had told his staff that the enemy's tremendous superiority in artillery, and even more in the air, has broken the front open. The second system was tactical air power, integrated with ground maneuver at the small unit level. By 1944, Major General Elwood R. Quesada's 9th Tactical Air Command had perfected a set of procedures that German generals watched with disbelief. P-47 Thunderbolts, each mounting 8 50-caliber machine guns, plus bombs and rockets, orbited continuously over advancing armoured columns from dawn to dusk. They circled at altitude waiting for calls, ready to dive on any target the ground troops identified. Shortly before Cobra, Quesada had persuaded Bradley to try something revolutionary. He placed an Air Force pilot with a VHF aircraft radio inside the lead Sherman tank of each armoured column, creating a direct link between the ground commander and the fighter bombers overhead. The system, which became known as Armoured Column Cover, transformed close air support from a pre-arranged event into a responsive capability available on demand. When a tank column encountered resistance, the air controller in the lead tank radioed the orbiting fighters, described the target, and watched them dive to attack. P-47s could strike targets within 3 minutes of a call. The cumulative effect of continuous air coverage was that German daylight movement became nearly impossible anywhere near the front. Tank columns that tried to move during the day were spotted within minutes and attacked within seconds. Supply convoys were strafed on every road. Artillery batteries that fired more than a few rounds drew immediate attention from circling fighters. Rommel had written that anyone who has to fight, even with the most modern weapons, against an enemy in complete command of the air, fights like a savage against modern European troops, under the same handicaps and with the same chances of success. By Normandy, this observation had become prophecy. The third system was the American radio network, the nervous system that tied everything else together. Every infantry company in the American Army carried the SCR-300 backpack FM radio. Every rifle platoon had the SCR-536 handy-talkie for internal coordination. Every Sherman tank was equipped with the SCR-508 series vehicular radio. Company commanders talked to battalion. Battalion talked to regiment. Artillery forward observers talked to fire direction centers. Ground controllers talked to aircraft. All of this communication happened on interoperable networks that used standardized frequencies and procedures. The German army, though it had pioneered tactical radio use in the campaigns of 1939 and 1940, fielded fewer radios per unit by 1944. More importantly, the Germans had nothing equivalent to the tank-mounted air control set that gave American armored columns direct communication with supporting aircraft. Behind all three systems stood a logistical base that German commanders could only envy. The Red Ball Express, running from the Normandy beaches to the advancing front from August 25th to November 16th of 1944, delivered roughly 412,000 tons of supplies, using 6,000 trucks and 23,000 drivers, running around the clock on one-way roads. American artillery battalions routinely fired hundreds of rounds per gun per day during major operations. German batteries were rationed to a fraction of that amount. The German Army of 1944 remained a formidable tactical instrument at the small unit level. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, the Panzer Lehr Division, the 2nd Panzer Division, the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, these formations fought with extraordinary skill in the hedgerows and villages of Normandy. Their young soldiers, many of them fanatical volunteers raised on Nazi ideology, attacked with courage that impressed even their enemies. What they could not do was survive against the American system. What they could not do was sustain their strength under continuous bombardment. What they could not do was scale their tactical excellence to operational effect when every movement was observed, every concentration bombed, every reinforcement interdicted. Several structural failures compounded to produce this outcome. The first and most decisive was the absence of the Luftwaffe. The combined American and British strategic bombing campaign had gutted German fighter strength by the spring of 1944. The intensive air battles of Big Week in February of that year killed experienced German pilots faster than training programs could replace them. During May of 1944 alone, the Luftwaffe lost 25% of its entire fighter pilot establishment. New pilots arrived at squadrons with fewer than 100 hours of flight time, facing American pilots with 3 or 4 times that experience. On D-Day itself, total Luftwaffe defensive sorties over the beaches numbered only a few hundred against Allied sortie totals exceeding 14,000. The German bomber force assembled for Normandy numbered barely 250 serviceable aircraft, facing thousands of Allied fighters and interceptors. Any attempt at daylight bombing was suicide. The practical effect was that American forces operated under an air umbrella that their fathers in the trenches of 1918 could not have imagined. Piper Cubs puttered over the battlefield, spotting artillery targets. Fighter bombers circled constantly. Transport aircraft delivered supplies to forward airstrips. The Germans could do none of these things. Their aircraft were either destroyed on the ground or shot down within minutes of taking off. Fuel shortage cascaded into every aspect of German operations. Panzer divisions could move only at night to avoid air attack, and even then only for short distances before their tanks ran dry. Training was slashed to conserve fuel. Replacements arrived at the front with too few hours of practice to survive first contact. General Heinrich Eberbach, commanding 5th Panzer Army during the breakout, wrote that in the final stages of the Falaise retreat, the loss of tanks through lack of fuel was greater than the losses inflicted by all enemy weapons combined. The second failure was command dysfunction at the highest levels. Rommel had been appointed Inspector General of Western Defences in November of 1943, and assumed operational command of Army Group B in December of that year. Receiving full authority in January 1944, he had been crushed by Allied material superiority in Africa. He understood exactly what would happen if the Allies established themselves ashore. The invasion must be defeated on the beaches, Rommel insisted to anyone who would listen. Once the Allies gain a lodgment and bring their full weight of material to bear, we will never drive them back into the sea. But Rommel's assessment was not shared by all senior German commanders. Gerd von Rundstedt, the aging theatre commander, and General Leo Geyer von Schweppenburg, commanding Panzer Group West, favoured the classic solution of mobile defence. Hold the panzer reserves inland. Allow the enemy to advance beyond his air cover, then strike with concentrated armor against exposed flanks and supply lines. It was the doctrine that had worked in Poland, in France, in Russia. It assumed freedom of movement, air parity, and operational flexibility that no longer existed in the West. Hitler split the difference in the worst possible way. He released only 3 panzer divisions to Rommel's direct control and kept the rest under his personal approval at OKW headquarters, hundreds of miles from the front. This meant that when the invasion came, the most powerful panzer formations in France could not move without authorization from a man who was asleep when the first parachutes opened over Normandy. When the invasion came on June 6th, the 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division spent the critical morning hours waiting for release orders that Hitler, at his mountain retreat in Bavaria, had not authorized. His staff was reluctant to wake him with unconfirmed reports of a possible invasion. By the time the panzers moved, Allied aircraft were overhead in strength and Allied forces were consolidating beachheads that should have been crushed in their infancy. Throughout the campaign that followed, Hitler's inflexible orders prevented the tactical disengagements that might have preserved German combat power. Units were ordered to hold positions that had already been bypassed. Counterattacks were demanded against objectives that no longer mattered. Commanders who advocated tactical withdrawal were dismissed or worse. The result was a series of catastrophic decisions that turned a difficult situation into a hopeless one. The culminating disaster was Operation Lutich, the Mortain counterattack of August 7th through 13th. Against the unanimous advice of his commanders, Hitler ordered the remnants of 4 panzer divisions, the 1st SS, 2nd SS, 2nd Panzer, and 116th Panzer, to strike westward and cut the American supply corridor at Avranches. Cluj could assemble only about 300 tanks and assault guns for the attack, far fewer than necessary. Worse, Allied signals intelligence had decrypted the German plans. Bletchley Park delivered the key messages to Bradley on the evening of August 6th, just hours before the assault. The Americans knew the attack was coming. They massed artillery to support the 30th Infantry Division, Old Hickory, around Mortain. Fighter-bomber squadrons were alerted for maximum effort. The German attack began before dawn on August 7th and achieved initial surprise. American units fell back from some forward positions, but the critical position, Hill 314 east of Mortain, held. The 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment came under command of Captain Reynold Eriksson, the senior surviving officer after the battalion command post was overrun in Mortain town. For 6 days his men held that hilltop, cut off from resupply except by parachute drops and by artillery spotter planes that landed on the hilltop under fire. From their vantage point, American forward observers directed continuous artillery fire onto German columns in the valleys below. The fighting around Hill 314 became one of the epic small unit actions of the war. German infantry attacked repeatedly, pushing up the slopes under artillery fire that they could see being directed from the hilltop. Panzers attempted to support the attacks, but were driven back by American tank destroyers and by P-47 Thunderbolts that arrived within minutes of being called. At night, German infiltrators probed the American perimeter, and close combat erupted in the darkness. The defenders ran low on ammunition, on water, on medical supplies. The wounded lay in improvised aid stations with little morphine remaining, yet they held. On the morning of August 12th, a relief column from the 35th Infantry Division finally broke through to Hill 314. The men who walked off that hilltop were hollow-eyed with exhaustion, bearded, filthy, many of them wounded. They had held a position that anchored the entire American line. If Hill 314 had fallen, the German panzers might have reached Avranches. Instead, the counteroffensive died in the valleys below the hill. By August 13th, Hitler's counteroffensive had collapsed in blood and burning vehicles. The Germans lost roughly 120 tanks and assault guns, more than a third of the armor committed, largely to American artillery and P-47 Thunderbolts. The 30th Infantry Division lost about 1,800 men killed, wounded, or missing. The defenders of Hill 314 lost nearly 300 of their roughly 700 men but held their ground. The destruction of Army Group B between August 12th and 21st showed what American combined arms looked like at full tempo. While Patton's Third Army swept south and east from Avranches and then hooked north toward Argentan, The Canadian 1st Army and Polish 1st Armoured Division ground south from Caen toward Falaise. Between these converging pincers, two German armies, the 7th under SS General Paul Hauser and 5th Panzer Army under Heinrich Eberbach, were funneled into a 20-mile-long corridor choked with burning vehicles. The roads inside the pocket became death traps. Every route eastward was clogged with retreating columns, horse-drawn artillery mixed with trucks, tanks attempting to push past stalled convoys, ambulances carrying wounded men who would never reach hospitals. Allied aircraft circled overhead constantly, bombing and strafing anything that moved. Typhoon fighter bombers fired rockets into the packed columns. P-47s dropped 500-pound bombs at choke points and then returned to strafe survivors. Artillery ranged on every crossroads and bottleneck. German soldiers who survived the pocket described scenes of carnage that haunted them for the rest of their lives. The collapse of command structure accelerated the disaster. Communications between higher headquarters and frontline units broke down entirely. Divisional commanders lost contact with their regiments. Regimental commanders lost contact with their battalions. Officers found themselves leading ad hoc groups of stragglers, trying to find escape routes through the closing gap. Some units maintained discipline and withdrew in relatively good order. Others dissolved into panic-stricken mobs. Between 80,000 and 100,000 German troops were encircled. Roughly 10,000 to 15,000 were killed inside the pocket. 40,000 to 50,000 were taken prisoner. Those who escaped eastward did so without most of their equipment. Allied investigators counted approximately 500 tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned. Of nearly 400 armoured vehicles surveyed in the northern sector alone, the vast majority had been abandoned by their crews or destroyed for lack of fuel. The smell of the Falaise Pocket lingered for weeks. Dead horses by the thousands, dead men by the thousands, rotting in the August sun. French civilians who returned to their farms found fields littered with German equipment, with personal effects, with bodies that burial details had not yet reached. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, which had entered Normandy with nearly 20,000 men and 150 tanks, suffered catastrophic losses. It lost 94% of its armour, nearly all its artillery, and the majority of its vehicles. Across the entire Normandy campaign from June 6th to August 31st, German casualties reached approximately 300,000 to 400,000 men, including some 210,000 prisoners. Equipment losses included roughly 1,500 tanks and self-propelled guns. Allied casualties totaled approximately 210,000, of which about 126,000 were American. Eisenhower toured the closed pocket 48 hours after the gap was sealed. The battlefield at Falaise, he later wrote, was unquestionably one of the greatest killing fields of any of the war areas. It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. The scenes could be described only by Dante. The post-war foreign military studies, over 2,000 manuscripts prepared by captured German officers between 1945 and 1954, provide the richest body of German testimony about what American combined arms felt like from the receiving end. Bayerlein alone wrote 20 separate manuscripts, covering everything from the approach march of Panzer Lehr to Normandy to the final collapse at Falaise. Paul Hauser wrote extensively on 7th Army operations during the breakout. Rudolf Christoph Freiherr von Gersdorf, who served as 7th Army Chief of Staff, produced detailed operational analyses that American staff officers studied for decades. Heinrich von Luttwitz described 2nd Panzer Division's futile operations against the encirclement. These officers wrote with a mixture of professional detachment and personal bitterness. They had been defeated by an enemy they had once dismissed, and they were writing for captors who required honest assessments. The result is a body of testimony that reveals both the effectiveness of American methods and the German inability to counter them. Several themes recur across these manuscripts. The first is simple awe at the scale of American material superiority. German officers described artillery barrages that continued for hours without slackening, air attacks that arrived within minutes of any movement, and supply flows that seemed endless. The second is shock at American artillery responsiveness. German officers had expected heavy bombardment. What they had not expected was how quickly American guns could shift from target to target. They had been accustomed to artillery that required careful preparation. American guns seemed to appear out of nowhere and strike without warning. The third theme is grudging respect for American tactical adaptation. This respect contrasts sharply with the contempt German officers had expressed in late 1942 when they first encountered the Americans. By Normandy, the condescension was gone. The Americans, Bayerlein remarked in a 1945 interrogation, improve every single time they are hit. A fourth theme appears consistently in the studies written by officers of the SS Panzer divisions. These officers noted how rapidly American artillery and fighter bombers killed the company and battalion commanders whose tactical initiative was the foundation of German military effectiveness. German doctrine depended on experienced leaders at every level. When those leaders died, the system broke down into confused improvisation. The tactical system that destroyed Panzer Lehr and broke Army Group B became the foundation of American military doctrine for generations. The armored column cover procedures evolved through Korea and Vietnam into joint air attack concepts and eventually into air-land battle doctrine in 1982. The fire direction center methodology survived into the digital age. The principle that air and ground forces are co-equal partners remains embedded in American joint doctrine today. The German generals who wrote their foreign military studies understood what had defeated them. When interrogators asked what had cost them the campaign, they rarely blamed any single weapon or decision. They blamed the system, fire direction centers that massed artillery in minutes, radios that linked every echelon of command, aircraft that orbited overhead waiting for targets, logistics that delivered shells and fuel in quantities they could not imagine. Each element supported the others. Together they formed something greater than the sum of their parts. What happened at Normandy holds lessons that extend beyond military history. The American Army of 1942 had been humiliated by an enemy with superior training and combat experience. Rather than making excuses, American commanders studied what had gone wrong. They identified specific deficiencies. They developed solutions. They tested those solutions in training and combat. They welcomed innovations from the lowest levels, accepting devices like the Kulin Rhino even when they came from sergeants rather than generals. The German army fought with extraordinary courage in Normandy. Individual soldiers and units performed feats that deserved respect. But the German military system could not learn and adapt at the rate the Americans demonstrated. Partly this was Hitler's interference, partly it was resource starvation, partly it was institutional rigidity. For whatever combination of reasons, the Wehrmacht of 1944 could not match the American rate of organizational learning. When Bayerlein surveyed the moonscape that had been his division's position on July 26th, he grasped what had happened. When Klug wrote his farewell letter to Hitler 3 weeks later, urging him to end a hopeless struggle before taking his own life on August 19th, he grasped the implications. The war in the West was lost. When the German generals wrote their post-war studies in American captivity, they grasped the institutional lesson. They had not lost because they fought poorly. They had lost because the Americans, learning fast and building systematically, had created a military system that the finest tactical skill could not overcome. The men who fought in those Norman fields deserve to be remembered. The German grenadiers who held their positions under carpet bombing, the American infantrymen who crawled through hedgerows one field at a time, the tank crews who burned in Shermans and Panthers alike, the forward observers who flew through anti-aircraft fire to call artillery. All of them paid the price of decisions made far above their heads. The difference between victory and defeat was not courage. Both sides had that in abundance. The difference was that one side had spent 15 years building an integrated system of war, and the other had not. The Panzer Lehr Division's destruction was the work of a single morning. The preparation for that morning had begun at Fort Sill in 1931, continued in the Louisiana Maneuvers of 1941, and been refined across Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy. The Americans won in Normandy not because they were braver or smarter than their opponents, but because they had learned how to fight as a system that the finest tactical excellence could not defeat.